I've always been a fan of hiking and camping, but after my encounter with a Wendigo, I'm not so sure anymore. It was late fall, and I decided to take a solo trip into the woods. The leaves were changing, and the crisp air was invigorating. I had planned to camp out for a few nights, but after the first night, something changed. I woke up to strange noises in the woods. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just animals, but the sounds grew louder and more sinister. I tried to fall back asleep, but the noises persisted, and I began to feel uneasy. Suddenly, a rank smell filled my nostrils, and I knew that I wasn't alone. I sat up in my sleeping bag and saw it. A tall, emaciated figure, with hollow eyes and antlers on its head. It was a Wendigo. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I was frozen with fear. The Wendigo let out a guttural growl, and I knew that I had to act fast. I grabbed my flashlight and pepper spray and tried to make myself look as big and intimidating as possible. The Wendigo stood its ground, but I could tell that it was hesitant. I took my chance and ran as fast as I could. I could hear the Wendigo chasing me, its hooves pounding on the ground. I was terrified, but I knew that I had to keep running. I finally made it back to my car and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the woods. I don't know if I'll ever go camping again. The thought of encountering another Wendigo is too much to bear. But I'm grateful that I lived to tell the tale. I never believed in the supernatural until I saw it with my own eyes. It was a cold, crisp night in the middle of the Arizona desert. I was on my way back home after a long day of hiking when I saw something moving in the distance. At first, I thought it was a coyote or a stray dog, but as I got closer, I realized that it was something else entirely. It was walking on two legs, but it wasn't human. Its skin was dark and leathery, and its eyes glowed in the darkness. I froze, unsure of what to do. I had heard stories of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches that could take on the form of any animal they desired. I didn't believe in those stories, but here was one, right in front of me. The skinwalker stopped in its tracks and turned its head to look directly at me. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I locked eyes with the creature. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I slowly backed away, not taking my eyes off the skinwalker. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me as I retreated. I finally turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I quickly got inside and locked the doors, still shaking from what I had just seen. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the skinwalker chasing after me. I never spoke about the incident to anyone, afraid they would think I was crazy. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. And I never ventured out into the desert alone at night again. I've always been fascinated by cryptids and urban legends, so when I heard about the Gigopler, I knew I had to go out and try to find it. I didn't believe in it at first, but after hearing so many stories about it, I started to think that there might be something to it. One summer, I decided to go on a camping trip in a remote area where there had been sightings of the Gigopler. I wanted to see if I could find any evidence of its existence. I packed my camping gear and set off on my adventure. The first few days were uneventful. I hiked through the forest, set up camp, and explored the area. But on the third night, things started to get weird. I was sitting by my campfire when I heard a strange noise coming from the trees. It sounded like something was moving around, but it was too dark to see anything. I tried to brush it off as just an animal, but then I heard a low growl. It didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard before. I started to feel uneasy and decided to go to bed early. That's when I saw it. I woke up in the middle of the night to see a huge, one-eyed creature standing outside my tent. It was at least 7 feet tall and had long, gangly arms that almost touched the ground. Its skin was gray and covered in matted fur, and it had a mouthful of sharp teeth. I froze, too scared to move or even make a sound. The Gigopler just stood there, staring at me with its one eye. It didn't move or make any noise. It was like it was studying me. After what felt like an eternity, the Gigopler finally turned and walked away into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, too scared that it would come back. The next morning, I packed up my camp and left the area as quickly as I could. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, not even my closest friends. I was too scared that they would think I was crazy. I still don't know what the Gigopler wanted or why it came to my campsite that night. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never go looking for it again. Some things are better left undiscovered. I've always been an avid hiker, so when my friends suggested we go on a weekend camping trip in the middle of the forest, I couldn't resist. We packed our gear and headed out early Saturday morning, excited to spend the next few days exploring the wilderness. The first day was uneventful. We set up camp, went on a few hikes, and sat by the fire telling stories late into the night. But on the second day, things took a turn for the worse. We had set out early in the morning to explore a new trail, one that wasn't marked on any of the maps we had. We figured it would be an adventure and were excited to see where it led us. As we walked deeper into the forest, the trail became increasingly difficult to navigate. The trees were thicker, the brush was higher, and the path was steep and rocky. But we were determined to press on, convinced that the trail would eventually lead us to some hidden treasure. As the day wore on, we began to notice strange things happening around us. First, we heard a rustling in the bushes, and then a low growling sound. We shrugged it off as just some kind of wildlife and kept moving forward. But soon, we began to see something moving in the shadows. It was hard to make out at first, but as we got closer, we realized it was some kind of creature. It was tall and thin, with matted fur and glowing eyes. It stood on 2 legs, like a man, but there was something undeniably animalistic about it. We froze, unsure of what to do. The creature stood there, watching us, and then let out a bone-chilling scream. It was unlike anything we had ever heard before, a mix of rage and hunger that made our blood run cold. We knew we had to get out of there fast, so we turned and ran as fast as we could back towards camp. The creature followed us, its screams growing louder and more frantic as it closed in on us. We made it back to camp, panting and terrified, and barricaded ourselves inside our tent. We could hear the creature outside, scratching and snarling, and we knew we were lucky to be alive. The next morning, we packed up our gear and hiked back to civilization as fast as we could. We didn't speak much on the way back, both of us still shaken from the encounter. Years later, I still have nightmares about that creature in the woods. Some say it was a Wendigo, a creature from Native American folklore known for its insatiable hunger and ability to mimic human voices. All I know is that I never want to encounter it again, and I urge anyone who goes into the wilderness to be careful, and always stay on marked trails. I was driving down a remote stretch of highway in the desert, trying to make it to my friend's house before the sun set. I had heard stories about skinwalkers before, but I never really believed them until that night. As I was driving, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was just a deer or a coyote, but as I got closer, I realized it was something much more sinister. The figure was tall and thin, with matted fur and glowing eyes. It was standing on 2 legs, but its arms were unnaturally long and seemed to drag along the ground. I slammed on the brakes, and the figure disappeared into the darkness. I tried to shake it off and continued on my way, but I couldn't help feeling like something was following me. Every time I looked in my rearview mirror, I thought I saw the figure lurking in the shadows. As I got closer to my friend's house, I noticed that the air had grown thick and heavy. It was like something was pressing down on me, suffocating me with its weight. I felt like I was being watched, and the feeling only intensified as I pulled into my friend's driveway. I got out of the car, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, but then I heard a low growling sound coming from behind me. I turned around, and there it was, the Skinwalker, standing only a few feet away. I froze, unable to move as the Skinwalker began to move closer. Its eyes glowed brighter, and its growls grew louder. But then, out of nowhere, my friend's dog came bounding out of the house, barking and snarling at the Skinwalker. The Skinwalker backed away, disappearing into the darkness once again. I knew I had been lucky to escape with my life, and I vowed to never underestimate the power of the supernatural again. To this day, I still have nightmares about that encounter. I never want to come face to face with a Skinwalker again, but I know that they're out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. I was on a solo hiking trip in the remote woods of Montana when I saw something that still gives me chills to this day. I had heard rumors of Gigoplers in the area, but I never thought I'd actually encounter one. It was just after sunset when I spotted movement in the trees ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The creature was about 7 feet tall with matted fur covering its body. Its head was disproportionately large with one huge, glowing eye that seemed to stare right through me. I froze in fear as the Gigopler began to approach me. Its movements were slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I could hear its labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath its massive feet. As it got closer, I realized that this creature was not a mere animal, but something far more sinister. Its single eye seemed to be filled with a malevolent intelligence, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I knew that I had to get out of there before it was too late, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots and rocks, but the Gigopler continued to advance. Just when I thought it was all over, a group of hikers appeared out of nowhere, their flashlights shining brightly on the Gigopler. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream before retreating back into the woods. I never saw the Gigopler again, but the memory of that encounter still haunts me to this day. I'll never forget the feeling of pure terror that washed over me, or the strange sense of unease that lingered long after the creature was gone. I learned that day that there are things in this world that are far beyond our understanding, and that sometimes, the only thing we can do is run. I've always been an avid hiker, so when my friends suggested a camping trip in the remote wilderness of northern Canada, I was all in. We were well prepared and had all the necessary supplies for a week in the woods. Little did I know that this trip would turn out to be the most terrifying experience of my life. It was our third night camping, and we were sitting around the campfire, telling spooky stories. I don't believe in the supernatural, so I was amused when one of my friends started talking about Wendigos. He described them as creatures that inhabited the woods and preyed on unsuspecting hikers. I laughed it off, thinking it was just a made-up tale. But as the night went on, I began to feel uneasy. It was as if something was watching us from the darkness beyond the firelight. I tried to shake off the feeling and convinced myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of a strange, eerie howling. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as the sound grew louder and more intense. I nudged my friend who was sleeping next to me, but he didn't wake up. Suddenly, I saw movement in the woods beyond the fire. It was a dark, shadowy figure that looked human-like, but it was much taller and thinner than any human I had ever seen. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew that it wasn't a person. The creature was staring at me, and I could feel its eyes piercing through me. I was frozen with fear and couldn't move. The creature started to move towards me, and I could hear its footsteps getting closer and closer. It was then that I realized that it was a Wendigo. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually, the creature disappeared into the woods. I was shaken and terrified, but I knew I had to stay quiet and not wake my friends. I waited until the morning to tell them what had happened. We packed up our gear and hiked back to civilization as quickly as we could. I never went back to that area again, and I never want to encounter a Wendigo again. I can still hear its haunting howl in my nightmares, and I know that it's out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or paranormal. Ghost stories and urban legends always seemed like harmless fun to me, nothing more. That was until I had my own encounter with a skinwalker. It was late at night, and I was driving through a remote part of the desert. I had just left a friend's house and was heading back home when I saw something strange on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It stood on two legs and was covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its teeth were sharp and pointed. But what struck me the most was the feeling of pure evil that emanated from it. I slowed down as I passed the creature, trying not to draw attention to myself. But it was too late. The skinwalker had already noticed me. It turned its head and looked directly at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I drove as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. But the skinwalker was faster. It ran alongside my car, matching my speed effortlessly. I could hear its claws scraping against the pavement, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it caught me. Suddenly, I heard a gunshot. It was my own, as I had a firearm with me. The skinwalker let out a blood-curdling scream and fell to the ground. I took the opportunity to speed away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I got home that I realized how shaken I was. I had never been so afraid in my life. And to this day, I can still hear the skinwalker scream ringing in my ears. I don't know what that creature was or why it was after me. But I know one thing for sure, I never want to encounter a skinwalker again. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, the raw beauty of it all. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever go back. It was a solo camping trip, something I've done dozens of times before. I hiked deep into the forest, miles from any other human being. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves. That's when I heard it. A low growling noise, coming from somewhere behind me. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just an animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I turned around and saw it. A gigopler. It stood about 7 feet tall, with matted fur and one giant, glowing eye in the center of its forehead. It looked like something out of a nightmare. I froze. I knew I was supposed to make noise, to make myself seem bigger and scarier than the creature in front of me. But I couldn't move. I was too terrified. The gigopler started to move towards me, its growls getting louder and more menacing. I stumbled backwards, tripping over a log and falling onto my back. The creature was closing in, its hot breath on my face. But then, something strange happened. The gigopler suddenly stopped, its eye narrowing in confusion. It sniffed the air and then turned and ran off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I lay there for what felt like hours, shaking with fear. When I finally got up, I packed up my campsite and hiked out of the forest as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, in a crowded campsite with other people around me. I've told a few people about what happened, but most of them don't believe me. They say it was just my imagination, or that I saw a bear or a wolf. But I know what I saw. And I know that I never want to see it again. The wilderness may be beautiful, but it can also be deadly. And there are things out there that we can't even begin to understand. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, and as an avid hunter, I've spent countless hours exploring the dense forests and mountains of northern Canada. But there was one hunting trip that I'll never forget, one that still haunts me to this day. It was a crisp October morning, and I was setting out to hunt for moose in the woods. I had camped out the previous night and had set out early, hoping to catch the animals off guard. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I made my way through the woods, something caught my attention. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a strange feeling in the air, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I shook it off and continued on my hunt. But as the day wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. It was like something was watching me, following me through the woods. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I knew deep down that something wasn't right. As the sun began to set, I decided to head back to camp. But as I turned around, I froze in terror. Standing before me was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, razor-sharp claws and glowing red eyes. It was a Wendigo. I had heard stories of the Wendigo before, but I had always dismissed them as folklore, the ramblings of superstitious locals. But there was no mistaking it. This creature was real, and it was staring right at me. I was frozen in terror, unable to move as the Wendigo began to approach me. I could feel its hot breath on my face as it let out an ear-piercing scream. I thought I was done for, that this was the end. But then, as suddenly as it appeared, the Wendigo disappeared into the woods. I stood there, trembling, for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, I managed to gather my wits and stumbled back to camp. I packed up my gear and left the woods that night, never looking back. I've never gone back to that part of the woods again, and I don't think I ever will. The memory of that encounter still sends shivers down my spine, and I know that I was lucky to make it out alive. I'm not one to believe in supernatural things, but what I saw that night still haunts me to this day. It was a warm summer evening, and I was out hiking with some friends in the wilderness. We had been hiking for a few hours when we heard a strange noise coming from the woods. At first, we thought it was just an animal, but as we got closer, we realized that it was something else entirely. There was a figure lurking in the shadows, and as we got closer, it started to move towards us. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The figure was tall, with long limbs and a slender body. Its skin was dark, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. It moved quickly and gracefully, almost like it was floating. We were all frozen in fear, unable to move or speak. The figure came closer and closer, and I could feel its breath on my neck. That's when I saw its face, and I knew that I was in the presence of a skinwalker. The creature spoke to me, and its voice sent shivers down my spine. It told me that it had been watching me for a long time, and that it had chosen me as its next victim. I could feel its hot breath on my face, and I knew that I was in serious trouble. But then something miraculous happened. My friend had brought a flashlight with him, and he shined it on the creature. It hissed and recoiled, and then it disappeared into the woods. We ran back to the safety of our campsite, and we stayed up all night, too afraid to sleep. We knew that we had narrowly escaped with our lives, and that we had witnessed something truly terrifying. I don't know what would have happened to me if my friend hadn't had that flashlight with him. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll always be grateful that I made it out alive. I'm not sure if what I saw was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I know for a fact that I never want to come face to face with a Gigopler again. It all started when I decided to take a solo camping trip to a remote area of the woods. I had always enjoyed spending time in nature, but this time felt different. The forest was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That feeling only grew stronger as night fell. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but every sound made me jump. And then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a low growl, coming from just beyond my campsite. I tried to tell myself that it was just a bear or a wolf, but I knew in my gut that it wasn't. And then, I saw it. A one-eyed creature, unlike anything I had ever seen before, emerged from the shadows. I froze, unable to move as the Gigopler advanced towards me. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its single eye glowed in the darkness. I could feel its hot breath on my face as it leaned in, and I knew that I was going to die. But then, something strange happened. The Gigopler backed away, almost as if it had changed its mind about attacking me. It disappeared into the woods, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I packed up my things and left the forest as quickly as I could. I never looked back, and I never spoke of what I saw to anyone. But I know that the Gigopler is still out there, lurking in the shadows and waiting for its next victim. If you ever find yourself alone in the woods and you hear a growl, don't ignore it like I did. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees.